Thank you for tuning into the Monocle Dynasty Podcast, where we keep an eye on Dynasty football. Your hosts dive deep on players, rankings, strategies, and much more. Make sure to follow us on Twitter at Monocle Dynasty. And now, here's your host.
Welcome back to the Monocle, where we keep an eye on Dynasty football. I'm your host, DynastyCoachA. Tonight, we have a very special edition of the podcast. We have our first ever Grudge match. And for that Grudge match, I am joined by aNellytics on Twitter. We've gone back and forth a little bit about a certain player that will remain nameless, even though it's in the title of the pod for now. But first, I want to go ahead and say, how are you doing, Nelly?
I'm good. Thanks for having me on, John.
Absolutely. So I want to, first and foremost, it is a Grudge match, but I'm excited about this, but I want to be, we're both very respectful of each other and everything like that. It has nothing to do with hatred or saying somebody's wrong or right. It has nothing to do with that. It's just two completely different philosophies of how we go into rookie drafts or think of rookie drafts. And I wanted to bring up both sides of the story. And so I thought it was kind of important. And that's why I wanted to go ahead and bring Nelly on here so that we could do that. And you guys can make your decision on which one you want to listen to, which one you think is right. Or maybe, just maybe, we will get an actual, a mind change on this one. And I can convince Nelly that I've been right this entire time, So, needless to say, like I said, it's in the show, the show link and everything. We're talking about Malik Willis. I've already done a couple pods. I've already done a lot of posts on Willis, and I haven't had the nicest things to say about him, but then you see everyone else, not everyone else, but you see a lot of people talking about he's the 101 in rookie drafts. He's the 102 at the very least. And the upside of the player, he's so exciting, this and that, and all that. And so we have to try to come together and figure out, where the disconnect is here. So why don't you go ahead and start us out there, Nelly, and just give us an idea of what you think of the player and, why you're so excited about him.
Yeah, so I guess let me start off, because this is more a philosophical approach that I then apply to Malik Willis. And the thought process that I have is that we, as a fantasy community, as a rookie evaluation community, we're way too confident in our ability to evaluate rookie quarterbacks, right? Like if you go and you look through the past 10 years, the hits that we've had, the guys who are now the elite quarterbacks in the NFL, they were good NFL prospects. Don't get me wrong. Patrick Mahomes was a good prospect. Deshaun Watson was a good prospect. Josh Allen, he was not a good prospect, but we'll talk about that later, I'm sure. But even Justin Herbert was a good prospect, not great prospect. And these are all guys who are not the first quarterback off the board. Meanwhile, we have guys last year. We have Trevor Lawrence and Justin Fields, who everyone in the community absolutely loved, and they started off slowly. We have past guys who the NFL have loved, and the fantasy community has loved as well. Guys like Tua. You just go through the list. Guys like Baker was number 1 overall, and these are guys who they were good prospects. I go through my process, right, and I say, "Ooh, these guys they have pretty good profiles. These should be good NFL quarterbacks." But it hasn't really worked out in that way, and so it goes back to the point of, well, I just don't think we're that good at projecting success at the NFL level. So to sum it up, the reason why I like Malik Willis is the one thing that we can absolutely project, it's very, very correlative from the college level to the NFL level, is rushing ability and how that contributes to fantasy points at the next level. If you run the ball in college, if you run for a certain percent market share of your team's rushing yards as a quarterback, that translates directly to how many fantasy points per game you score through rushing contributions at the next level. And Malik Willis is the 3rd highest in the past 8 years in terms of his rushing market share in college football.
All right, so I definitely see that in the numbers, but I tried to compare Malik to some other rushing quarterbacks that we have already in the league. The most recent ones in Lamar Jackson and Jalen Hurts. I would say Trey Lance as well, but we haven't seen him in the NFL, so it's kind of hard and he's one of the most raw prospects that we've ever seen, and like it's really hard to compare, especially with an FCS player. So I kind of just took him out of it because we don't have the story's not told on him. I didn't think that'd be fair, and so. One thing I noticed is even though he did overall have a great market share of rushing yards for his career, in this last season, which was his best season, it was actually below Jalen Hurts and Lamar Jackson's last season in college as far as rushing market share. I believe it was 44.7% for Malik, 45.6% for Jalen, and 52.4% for Lamar. Now, I mean, that's just one season. That's not telling the entire story or anything just as well. But I just kind of wanted to point that out. That's one of the numbers that I looked up. It's like this was his best season as far as college is concerned. Or like he put the most stats up. Maybe it wasn't his best season. Like technically his junior year was probably his best year. But I think that, when you start looking at some of the numbers, at least in the final season for all of them, that Lamar and Jalen kind of stand out there.
Yeah, I don't dispute that at all. Those guys were both. Those guys were both easily better prospects than Malik Willis. Not easily, but they were better prospects than Malik Willis.
Kane's in the chat saying Nelly has bad taste buds. I guess we got one on my side, but we also have Toronto Dave saying Nelly is right. So we're 1 for 1 here in the grudge match. It's just so I don't know if you want to go kind of tit for tat here with the stats and everything. We're both we both get into that nerdy lifestyle. So like I said, with the combined rushing market share and everything in their final season, Malik had 15.2 rushing attempts per game. Jalen had 16.6. Lamar had 17.8. And then that equated to 878 yards for Malik, 1,298 yards for Jalen, and 1,601 yards for Lamar. So, I mean, you see a substantial difference. And I haven't even brought up the fact that you're talking about SEC, Big 12, and then independent. Might as well be like the American Conference or like small school conference from Liberty University. So I think if you're talking about the rushing upside, just compared to those two players, no one else, I don't think he has the same rushing upside that those two players have.
Yeah, I guess in terms of the absolute ceiling, I agree with you. Like, I don't think he's going to ever put up the sort of season that Lamar Jackson did in his best year, where I think he set the rushing record for quarterback. Like, I agree with you. No one. I mean, Lamar is absurd. He's the closest thing that we've had to Mike Vick, and might even be better than Mike Vick as a rusher. It's more just the thing is we're not choosing between Lamar Jackson and Malik Willis, right? We're choosing between Malik Willis and Breece Hall and the wide receivers in this group. So while I don't think he's a 1-for-1 comparison with Lamar Jackson. Lamar Jackson is a slightly better rusher and played at a higher competition level. But I think it's a relatively solid comp if you want to talk about the ceiling outcome for Malik Willis and how his fantasy value could respond to that.
Yeah, I think, and that was why I brought those two up, just because, I think people want to go right to a Lamar or right to, at the very least, a Jalen Hurts with Malik. And I just don't, if you start looking at all of the numbers, I mean, even the rushing numbers aren't quite there, but then you start getting into the passing numbers and it's just, I mean, it's night and day. You have adjusted yards per attempt, Malik at 8.4, Jalen at 12.2, Lamar at 8.7. Once again, there's a difference in competition levels there. And I think I said SEC for Lamar earlier, and it definitely wasn't SEC, but a Power 5 school. 2.3 touchdown to interception ratio for Willis, 4.0 for Hurts, and 2.7 for Lamar. Now, this is all final season stats, so I mean, this isn't total career or anything like that. And then a 3.5% interception rate for Malik, 2.4 for Jalen, and 2.3 for Lamar. So you see substantial differences, huge differences in the passing game So if he's not as good as a rusher and he's not as good of a passer, my question is, how is he even going to get on the field? We've seen so many quarterbacks, especially Trey Lance, like we were talking about before. I don't want to compare the players, but we saw a raw prospect not get on the field last year for an entire season. And now I don't believe it per se, but there's still question marks. Is he going to get on the field this year? I think he will, but I guess it's not guaranteed either. So just the fact that there's those question marks, and I mean, obviously you can talk about the value part of the game there, but just the fact that there's those question marks, is he even going to see the field? How much of a chance is there to actually raise his value in Dynasty, especially if you're drafting him at 101, 102? It's kind of tough to go higher than that.
No, that's a great point that you bring up, and it's actually something that we've talked about in the Twitter thread before. Is when we've gone over this, is he's probably not going to play right away. Like almost everyone agrees that he's not ready to go right away, and I'm not going to dispute that. Consensus is probably right on that. I mean, NFL sources are even coming out saying that. But here's what I will say: if he goes top 10, which he's rumored to, if he even goes top 16, top 20. He's going to get a shot, right? Like an NFL team isn't going to spend that type of cost on a quarterback, especially if it's top 10, and not give him a shot, right? Like Daniel Jones was an absolutely awful prospect, and he got a shot pretty soon on. Josh Allen was not a good prospect. He got a shot early in his rookie year. Everyone gets a shot, right? And almost everyone. Josh Rosen is the only example we have of a team saying, hey, this guy is really bad. Like, let's move on. Let's cut our losses. And I think the percent chance of that happening with Malik Willis is so low because he's so toolsy as well and raw. And so teams see the potential. And that's why he's getting the rumored draft capital is the fact that he has those tools to put it all together. And I'm not going to sit here and lie to you and tell you that he has put it all together. He hasn't even come close to that. He struggled in the Sun Belt. Like it wasn't good, right? But it's the ceiling that's there. And then if we want to talk about the value, I'll touch on that a little bit. If you look at Trey Lance's value this past year, Trey Lance has gone up in value, and he stepped on the field once. It's just the fact that he's a first-round quarterback. He's getting closer to playing, and people see that rushing upside. He had one game where he had 16 carries. And he didn't even look good passing the ball, right? But it's just the upside from the 16 carries. You look at other guys. Patrick Mahomes went up in value his first year. Jordan Love has held value since he was a rookie or since he was drafted. He is not like if you look at a graph of his ADP, it's steady. And like Jordan Love, like he may never get a shot, like you mentioned. But here we are 3 years later, I think, and he's still the same in value. So while there's a chance he's not good as a quarterback, there's a very, very valid chance he's not good as a quarterback. He's an insulated asset in the sense that his value is not going to just dip right away.
Yeah, and I definitely see that side of the argument, and that's why I wanted to bring you on, because there's always the chance that he does see the field, he runs like hell, and he scores a lot of points. I guess I've just convinced myself by staring at all these numbers that I don't see him seeing the field in year one. And the reason for that, the reason why I'm so confident, and Toronto Dave kind of touches on it, but he said he gives me credit and he's retracting the L that he gave me earlier, and then he's been too hard on me, and Beth we trust. Now, what he's talking about, Beth, is just a joke name that I gave my model, and I've done a lot of research on these QBs. I've spent a lot of time on my quarterback model. And one of the things that I looked into this year was taking draft capital completely out of it, which I know sounds crazy because all we do is talk about draft capital. Well, it actually was really eye-opening for me because I saw a lot of good players at the top, and not all of them got draft capital. Russell Wilson's in the top tier. He obviously didn't get draft capital. Dak Prescott's in the top tier. He didn't get draft capital. Now, most of them did. But then we get in the second tier. Lamar and Jalen Hurts are both in that tier without draft capital. They obviously are good players, or at least scoring fantasy points. I mean, the model is specifically for scoring fantasy points. It has nothing to do with NFL, but I mean, they're kind of intertwined, but it's more for fantasy points. Then we get down to Malik Willis in tier 4. All right, so in tier 4, there is a a player in tier 4 hits a top 24 QB season 32% of the time, a top 12 season 14% of the time, and a top 5 season 14% of the time as well. Now that's only ends up being 3 players in that tier that actually hit those numbers. And one of them actually ends up being Kirk Cousins, who has the majority of those those top seasons. But here are some of the players in that tier that had high draft capital, because I added the draft capital back in. Christian Ponder drafted 12th overall. Blaine Gabbert drafted 10th overall. EJ Manuel 16th overall. Josh Rosen 10th overall. Daniel Jones 6th overall. Blake Bortles 3rd overall, and Carson Wentz 2nd overall. Now the last 2 were the only ones with top 12 or top 5 seasons. Now they both had one top 5 season and multiple top 12 seasons, but we also see that they're not very good. But pointless, or regardless, they had, or they scored points, and you could have traded them high and taking advantage of the value game there. So, but that's only 2 players out of all those players that were drafted high. And so when I start looking at that, it just makes me think, what are the odds that this guy that can't put it all, he has an 11% sack rate compared to Lamar and Jalen's like 5% and 4%, on top of everything else I said about the interceptions and everything else. How is this guy going to get on the field, score a bunch of points, and gain value? It just seems so unlikely.
Yeah, no, and I hear you on all that. And I like the sack rate is a big issue, right? Like that's a big thing. Although it's nice in the NFL, we don't lose points in most leagues in fantasy for sacks, but the NFL will care about that, right? So there's no denying that. But here's a hypothetical I want to pose to you, right? Like let's say he starts his second year, he starts the full season. Like considering the amount that he rushes, assume he sees 10 to 15 carries a game. That's do you think that's reasonable? Maybe let's say 10 carries a game.
Easily. Yeah.
Chance that a quarterback, like running the ball 10 times a game, just the way that fantasy scoring is, like if he starts a full season and he's getting 10 carries a game, I wish I had the numbers in front of me for this, but I feel like it would be impossible to not have a top 24 season. Like even if he stinks, like even if he's really bad, if he's running the ball 10 times a game, he's going to run as a quarterback at least 5 yards per carry, right? And he'll have a handful of touchdowns. The floor that gives you instantly puts you into the top 24 quarterbacks in the league, because to be top 24, you don't have to be good. You just need to be better than like the bottom 8 starters. You know what I mean? It's the top 3/4 of the league. So just from that perspective, right? Like I see your model. I know hit rates as a whole have been good so far, but when we look at it from a minute perspective and we look at Jalen Hurts and we look at his skill set and how that applies to the NFL, even if he's an objectively bad NFL quarterback, right? Like if he starts, I just don't see how he isn't at least top 24. And we look at someone like Jalen Hurts right now, who I think he's actually probably the best comp we have in terms of, if you think logically, like the throwing ability is not very good, but the rushing volume there and the rushing ability. And Jalen Hurts he was a better passing prospect. No denying that. But it doesn't really show in the NFL. I mean, there's no denying he's struggled to pass the ball. And yet what was he this past year? Like quarterback 4, quarterback 5 in points per game, especially when he was healthy. He was very, very good. So that's kind of where I'm at in terms of, like, I see your model. I see how Willis is a bad prospect as a whole, as a passer, but like just the rushing, I just can't ignore the rushing.
No, and like I said, I understand the argument. That I feel like when we first started arguing about it, in air quotes, it was more of like no, you're right, you're wrong, I'm right, like that kind of thing. But like the more I thought about it, it's just like I said, it's more of a philosophical thing. And at that point, it's just like, it's not really right or wrong. My whole point is that I feel like there are players, even though everyone seems to hate this draft class, I feel like there are like guaranteed, or guarantee is a bad word in any kind of rookie draft, but like there are very, very good prospects at the top end that I would rather take before I take somebody I feel is like a dart throw kind of shot, like Malik Willis. And I mean, maybe that means that, now, I mean, I actually have him at 111 right now. That could change, but that I'm sure that's crazy to you. But I mean, I guess like if you really wanted me to be like crazy about it, like okay, maybe like 105, something like that, then I'd start saying, okay, you know what? I really don't think that's crazy. I think the upside is there and I can see that. But when you're talking about those first 3 or 4 guys, it's just really hard for me to put him over that and just be like, oh, the upside's there. Like, but what about the floor? Like the floor is literally the basement. Like, we have to at least consider that fact when we're looking at these rookie prospects, because then, and I'm not saying, like I said, he could easily hit. It could happen. But I feel like every year people are like, oh, I drafted N'Keal Harry 101. Oh, I drafted, Daniel Jones 102. I did this and I did that. And it's just like, well, why don't we take that aspect of the game out of it and go get the players that are good? Maybe they don't have the QB1 overall ceiling, but they have a top 12 QB ceiling or, a top 12 wide receiver ceiling. And they're almost like, once again, I'm not going to say guaranteed, but they have very good chances of hitting, and I'll just take that upside, but with the much safer floor.
To kind of your philosophy, like where you try and look at. My whole philosophy is based around if you get 2 elite quarterbacks, then like plug your roster and you can always compete. I would take a little more.
I don't know if it's me or what, but I'm having a hard time hearing you. It's like clicking and stuff.
Let me unplug.
Could just be my headphones.
Chat, can you hear me? Do you hear issues from me? Did that sound any better,
now.
John?
Yeah, it sounds better now.
Oh, there we go. No, the chat said you were right, but I unplugged and replugged it back in. So I was saying, I feel like a lot of it comes down to your dynasty philosophy, right? How you like to run your teams. And for me, like my number one priority is getting 2 elite quarterbacks, because then you can kind of plug and play the rest of your roster and you're always competing. If you have quarterbacks who are giving you a 10 point per game edge over like your average quarterback, like that's so much more beneficial than the edge you get at the other positions. And then you talk about the downside, right? But I'm of the belief that even if he ends up being objectively bad, that there'll be time where I can sell out of it before his value truly like hits a cliff, right? Like I think it'll stay relatively steady. Like if we look at this past year, Trevor Lawrence and Zach Wilson were really bad, like really, really bad. And they were good prospects, right? So people have kept hope. Like, I don't think it's a 1-for-1 comparison with Willis this year, because there's a little bit more skepticism. But these guys are still going in, like, your Trevor Lawrence is still going in the late second in startups. Like, people still believe, and he was like as bad as it gets as a rookie. So it's just, I see the upside and I'm not scared of the downside, because I feel like I can get out of the downside. And then if we're talking about other prospects as well, I'm just like a wide receiver. I feel really good about this wide receiver class as well. Like we don't have a Chase, but we have a bunch of really good guys who are probably going to be really solid players in the NFL. But it just, I don't see the edge from them. So it's just, if I'm drafting someone at the 101 to 102, I'd like to get that edge.
Yeah, I definitely hear you there. I guess it really depends who you're talking to, because if you're talking to somebody in a Twitter league, with a bunch of degenerates and stuff that all they do is trade all day long, then that's one thing. But if you're talking to Joe Schmo in their home league, then sometimes it's not. I don't know about you. I have 3 home leagues, and with a bunch of guys that I love and enjoy playing with and everything, but they don't trade, they don't do anything. And so it's like, I think like 3 trades have gone down in the past 6 months, in those leagues, and it's just like, what are we doing here? But if somebody's in those leagues or that type of league, it's really tough to give them advice of like, go get this player and then trade them. So that's where kind of I started getting, I'm trying to talk to, or think of my listeners, and I have no idea what type of leagues they're in. And if you miss that window, if you have a 3-month window to sell him high and, and go get somebody else or whatever it might be, and you can't get a deal done in that 3-month window in that type of league, then, it's like, well, I just screwed myself. And, it's really nice to then be like, oh, but I didn't draft Malik Willis. I drafted so-and-so player that's now crushing it, and I can actually use him to score points. And, I don't know, have this like crazy notion that win a league. So, the value game is great. And I love playing the value game. And I'm in many other leagues where I trade constantly. There's trades going down all the time, and it's completely different, type of story there. But the goal there is still to win. And so I want to score points now, not necessarily worry about the value game all the time. And so, that's just, once again, I didn't go into this thinking I was going to convince you or change your mind or anything like that. It was just the bringing up the two sides of the story and going over it. I mean, I could probably bring up 150 other stats about why Malik Willis isn't very good and you shouldn't draft him early, but I don't think I'm going to change any minds by doing that.
No, the thing is, nothing you're saying is like wrong. Like everything you're saying is right? Like it's stuff that I've considered. It's just, I think it's differing philosophies and maybe differing sort of ways we like to play and interpret the data, that because the thing with data, right, is like it's not subjective, right? Like the numbers are the numbers and you do with them what you will, but you can't change the numbers. So it's just we've interpreted them in different ways.
Yeah, definitely. So, I was talking about the tiers in my QB model, and Toronto Dave's loving every second of it. Elite discussion per him, so I appreciate that, Dave. But so I said how Lamar and Jalen were in that tier 2, somewhat close to being up in the tier 1, but with that rushing ability. Then you have Willis in tier 4, but then I have a QB in tier 1 and a QB in tier 2 this season, for this rookie draft class. But I want to know, first and foremost, how do you feel about the rest of the QBs? Because I've heard everything. I've heard, two completely different sides of the story and everything in between. People love them, they hate them. Every single person has a different QB1, and it's kind of crazy this year. But how are you feeling about the rest of the draft class?
I love this class. Like it's not so much that I love it, like I love it respective to the rest of the community, right? Like I think the fantasy and the dynasty community as a whole is very prone to snowballing. Like they get the idea that this class is below average, and then all of a sudden it's the worst class of all time. So I think that we could talk about fantasy philosophies all day, but like that's like recognizing things like that is another thing that you can use to kind of take advantage of value. But anyway, sorry, that's a little bit of off track. No, I like this class a lot because what they do kind of fits my philosophy in the sense that this class is really mobile. Malik Willis is the best one, but Desmond Ridder had 3 seasons above 15% rushing market share. He had 2 seasons above 20, and he maxed out at 28% rushing market share. And he's a guy who's getting top 16 buzz in the NFL draft. It sounds like he's going to go round 1. And despite their imperfect record, I trust the NFL to relatively know what they're doing in terms of drafting these guys. So he's someone I also really like. I bet you your number 1 guy, if I had to guess, is Sam Howell, who was a very good passer at a young age. No, it's not. Okay, then it was Matt Corral, who I also really like. Matt Corral was a good passer for 2 years, and I'm sure you'll go into that. He was a efficient passer for 2 years in college, and he also was a good runner on the ground for 2 years in college. He had a couple seasons greater than 20% rushing market share. And then Sam Howell, the other guy who I talked about, was a great passer as well, and he rushed for a year. And he's not the best athlete in the world, but he showed the desire to run, so that prevents upside at the NFL level. So I guess in summation, right, like these guys are dropping to the early second round of drafts, of rookie drafts. And it's just like, these are guys with rushing upside who probably aren't the best passers, but then again, what do we know? Like the NFL isn't even good at projecting passing ability to the next level. So like I'm okay with taking on that unknown with the presented upside.
Yeah, and I see it. I see the upside that you're talking about. Obviously, a lot of people are getting excited about Ritter. I'm not as excited. I think he has a lot of like similar flaws as Malik Willis has. The funny thing is they're very similarly scored in my model. Ritter is actually slightly ahead of Willis for what that's worth. So I think what's nice about it. Now, I'm not going to take him early, and I've seen some people taking Ritter as early as like 106 and stuff like that, but I've also seen him go in like the early second, and I feel like that's a completely different story. You're talking about that's where I feel very comfortable taking an upside player like that, and I have no issues with it whatsoever. But beyond that, like I said, I really like Matt Corral and Sam Howell. I feel like they're just getting shit on for no reason whatsoever. I really don't understand it. And people are talking about Corral being. I was listening to a podcast today while I was at work, and I mean it was recorded at least within the last few days, and they were talking about Corral being like a late second pick or something like that in the NFL draft. Matt Corral got invited to the draft. They only do that if you're like a 99.9% guaranteed to be drafted in the first round. Now, there's always that one crazy, player that doesn't get drafted in the first round, even though it was expected. So, I mean, I guess there is that chance, but they wouldn't have brought him in if they didn't think he was getting drafted at some point in the first round. And obviously I've heard talking about Sam Howell going in the third round of the NFL draft, or, possibly even later than that. And it just seems crazy, like he was considered the QB1 in the class by a lot of people as even going into like mid-season of the college season, like it really, I don't know how you go from that to a third round pick without just completely, destroying or like, just being terrible. And the thing is, he wasn't terrible. He did not have his best season or by any means, but he also showed us something else with the rushing ability that he didn't really show us before, or at least not as much of. And so if we're all getting freaking out about rushing upside, why are we not doing it with him? And I get, everyone says it's not the same. It's not the same. I get it. He's not the athlete that these other guys are, but he still can do it. And, that's really the important part. But what's more important to me is that we can get those players. I'm seeing it in a million mocks, and maybe it's going to change after the NFL draft, but I'm seeing these players like 202, 203, 204. And it's like, that's where the value is. So why, and once again, to bring it back, why am I going to draft Malik Willis and the possible floor there at 101, 102 when I can take, whoever, Garrett Wilson, whoever I consider my wide receiver 1, a Kenneth Walker, if I really want to go that route with the running back 2 at 102, something like that. Why am I going to take Malik Willis there when I can just take one of those guys and then get a Matt Corral or a Sam Howell at 203?
That's a great point. I would push back by saying, why not both? Like it from my perspective, because I like to look at it from a fluid perspective in terms of I'm okay with moving guys. Like it's all value for me. Like I'm okay with taking both, and maybe I don't have enough quarterback slots on my roster to fit both of them in, but then I can trade one if they both hit. But like to your point, like if you're not trying to trade, right? If you're trying to build a roster fully from your draft picks and you're trying to game theory, like when do I want to take the wide receiver versus the quarterback? Like I completely agree with you. Like Desmond Ridder at 201 is a much better value than Malik Willis at 102. And I love Malik Willis, but like just value wise, the upside they present is relatively similar. So the cost there being considered, you're absolutely right. That's a much better option. So I'm not going to push back on you at all there. I want to circle back. You touched on Sam Howell, and he's not as good of an athlete, and I love that you pointed that out, but you also pushed back on it a little bit, because I completely agree. Like one of the things that I always say is, I think it's more ability that players have the desire to run than it is that they like have the ability to run. Like if they have all the ability in the world to run, but they don't run, you're not going to score fantasy points, right? Like they just need to want to do it. Sam Howell doesn't need to run like Lamar Jackson to score like 3 or 4 fantasy points a game. He just needs to take a few carries a game for 5 to 8 to 10 yards and rush in a touchdown every once in a while. And he's shown the desire to do that.
Exactly. And I think, we see some of the best QBs still, not rushing for 800-900 yards. Now, obviously we love the guys that can do that. give me Kyler Murray all day, because I feel like he's one of the few that actually has the true combination of the passing and the rushing. I love that combo. Please, they were talking about Jameson Williams going there. Please give me Jameson Williams in Arizona. I want it so badly. But I still think you get these guys that get you an extra 40 rushing yards a game, and that's still close to a touchdown, or depending on your scoring and everything. And I just, it's just those few extra points can make a difference, over time. But he also has the passing ability. One of the big things I look at, when I'm looking at these QBs, besides the adjusted yards per attempt, like I was talking about, the interception rate, like I was talking about, is QBR. And it has been proven to be one of the better things to look at. And when you're looking at that for this draft class, it's Matt Corral, way up here, and then you have Sam Howell, Kenny Pickett, Desmond Ridder, Malik Willis, like all in that kind of like second tier as far as the QBR. So they kind of are all right around there. But then you have all of the other things when you talk about the interceptions, like the sacks, like everything else that gets mixed in. And that's where it starts lowering some of those other guys like Ridder and Willis. I really feel like, even as much as I like Hal, Corral's the one that's getting shit on the most. And I just don't get it. It makes no sense to me.
Oh, I love Matt Corral. Like, I would never claim to be a film watcher, right? But I enjoy watching football. So like I've watched some college games where these guys have played. And as a Steelers fan, as a quarterback needy team, like, I want them to draft Matt Corral. Intangibles don't show up in my model. I'm sure they don't show up in your model either, but I love kind of the grit that Matt Corral plays with. So I don't know. That's not actionable information that I'm saying right there, but just as an aside, I do love Matt Corral. I think he's going to be a good quarterback.
Well, you're one of the few. we're two of the few. So I love to hear that. I love that we actually agreed on something, because I didn't want to leave here without agreeing on something. Shane was in the chat. I didn't get to show all of his stuff, but I appreciate him showing up. Toronto Dave had about, I think, 82 comments. He loved it all. But I think we did a great job of touching on everything that we needed to talk about with Malik Willis, and then even getting into some of the QBs. Are there any other QBs that, before we get out of here, that interest you, even if it's like a late round flyer that it's just like, hey, throw him on the end of your roster or pick him up after a draft or whatever it might be?
No, I mean, there isn't really anyone. You have these round one or maybe round one guys, and then you have Carson Strong, who's potentially day two, and I want nothing to do with him just because he doesn't run the ball. And that's just, even if he gets a shot, like, where's the upside? And then just, no, there aren't any day three guys that really interest me. I know Caleb Ellaby's like some guy. He was an efficient passer in college. I just don't think he's going to get the draft capital. We didn't really talk about Pickett, and I don't hate Pickett. Like, his prospect's not that, his profile's not that good, but he's not a statue. Like, he moved a decent amount in college. He was over 10% rushing market share for 2 years. And like, if he gets drafted high and people start fading him to the second round, like, I'm okay with taking a shot on him as well, just because he's a quarterback, right, who's going to be starting for multiple years as a first round pick.
Yeah, and I mean, as of right now, a lot of people are expecting. Now, he wasn't one of the ones that was invited to the first round, for the draft. It was only Malik and Corral, if I mentioned that earlier or didn't mention that earlier. But I think with Pickett, kind of like what you said, I'm just not overly excited about him. But at the same time, I see him being a guy that people are going to say he has small hands. He didn't do it until his fifth year, so on and so forth. And I'm going to get a lot later than maybe I assumed I was going to, he was going to go. And I'm going to draft him because he's going to be a QB that's going to be on the field. And like, while I don't think he's going to be amazing, maybe he'll end up just being like slightly above average, like backup or something like that. But he's going to be given that opportunity. Whereas when you're drafting him at 205 or whatever, you're like, yeah, give me that. Now I have a fourth QB for when the injuries hit. Like last year I had, I think Tom Brady was on bye. Aaron Rodgers had COVID for 2 weeks, and Russell Wilson had broken his thumb or whatever, thumb or whatever the hell he had. And so I had 3 stud QBs, and they were all out. And I was starting Teddy Bridgewater and Taysom Hill, and I don't even think Taysom Hill started that week. So I was like, I mean, thank God I had 5 QBs, but at the same time, it was just like, what the hell's going on here? So sometimes you need that 4th and 5th QB. You know?
Definitely, and you never know, right? Like Justin Herbert a few years ago was drafted in the top 10 rounds, and or not 10 rounds, sorry, first 10 picks, and
he was drafted in the first 10 rounds. So
I wasn't wrong. But no, he's like quarterback 2, quarterback 3 in Dynasty, like 2nd or 3rd off the board in startups right now, and he wasn't that good of a prospect, right? Like he was a solid passer. He didn't really run the ball in college, but he knew he was an okay athlete. But people faded him to like almost the end of the first round in rookie draft. So it's more just like embrace the unknown in the sense that, like, I think people are probably too confident that Pickett's not going to be good. Like there's a chance, and it's higher than, like, people like to speak in absolutes, and he probably won't be good, but it's not 0. So
I agree. So last stat I wanted to bring up before we get out of here, I'll let you pimp out all your stuff and everything, what all you're doing is, I wanted to correct myself because I said that Malik Willis had like an 83 QBR. That was for his best season. His final season that I was kind of like, listing all the stats from was actually a 70 QBR. So, I mean, that's a substantial difference there. And, once going back to Jalen and Lamar, you're talking about 89.7 and 85.4. So just comparing those rushing QBs, I mean, I think I already made the point, but I don't see him being Jalen and Lamar, I guess is my main point. But go ahead and tell us where you're from, what you're doing, and what you're up to, and all that kind of good stuff, Nelly.
Sure, yeah. So I do a lot of chatting in the Devi Marketplace chat. I do a lot of arguing on Twitter too, aNellytics. That's where John and I made our connection. But I spend a lot of time in the Devi Marketplace Patreon. It's free to join, but we also have $20 a year to get myself and a couple others rankings for Devi prospects, and we also put out a second podcast every week where the Patreons can, well, not Patreons, but the subscribers can come and ask questions and be with us live. So it's a great community, whether you want to just chat Devi or kind of learn some things about Devi. It's great to join, and it's free. Like, there are a bunch of channels that you can join for free and ask questions. So yeah.
Yeah, I actually joined it a couple weeks ago. I'm not like extremely active in it or anything because I hate being in like 18 different chats. That's just like my personal preference. So I joined it, but I do see a lot of the comments, and they're always, there's always people talking about I'm starting up a league, who wants to join and stuff like that. There's a lot of cool stuff going on in that, even if you don't want to pay or do anything else, just getting in that in that Discord and talking to everyone is pretty cool. But I appreciate you, Nelly, coming on. I appreciate you joining the Grudge match. And hopefully you, the listeners, all learned a little something. And let us know. Reach out, whether it's on Twitter, DMs, whatever, and just and review or whatever you want to do, and just let us know who was right. We're gonna tally it all up, and we're gonna figure it all out. No, I appreciate you, Nelly, for coming on. We'll be back, guys. The NFL draft is next week. Like, this stuff is crazy. I can't believe it. I'm so excited. I'll be on a couple draft shows, and we'll obviously be going and discussing all of these players once we actually know where their landing spots are. Appreciate you once again. Thanks for listening. But for now, we're cashing out.